In this series, I'm breaking down all of the music concepts you need in order to be able to learn the piano self-taught. And in this video, I'm going to explain everything you need to know about time signatures. So let's get into it. In music, time signatures can be seen at the beginning of a piece of sheet music, and they are usually two numbers on top of each other. Although there may also be a C there, or a C with a line through it there, which I will also explain later on. And a time signature tells us how many beats there are in each bar or measure within the music. And not only that, but they also tell us the meter of a piece of music and how to feel the pulse of that piece of music. But firstly, what do the two numbers actually mean? Well, the top number in a time signature tells us literally how many beats there are within that bar. So it literally means how many. And the bottom number in a time signature tells us what type of beats we're counting within that bar. Now, this makes much more sense in American English opposed to British English, which I don't like to admit, but you'll see why. So if the bottom number in a time signature is 4, then this means we are counting quarter notes. And in British English, that means we are counting crotchets. If the bottom number in a time signature is 8, then that means you are counting eighth notes. Or in British English, that would be quavers. And if the bottom number in a time signature is 2, then that means we are counting half notes, or in British English, that would be minims. So in American English, the bottom number in a time signature kind of directly corresponds to the note that you are counting. Whereas in British English, because we describe note lengths using words like crotchets, quavers, minims, it's much harder to see what the bottom number in a time signature means. This means that the bottom number in a time signature will be 1, which means a whole note, 2, which means a half note, 4, which means a quarter note, 8, which means an eighth note, 16, which means a 16th note, and so on. And for the fellow British people out there, 1 would be a semibreve, 2 would be a minim, 4 would be a crotchet, 8 would be a quaver, 16 would be a semiquaver, and so on. Which means if you have a time signature of 4/4, that literally means you will be counting 4 crotchets or quarter notes in a bar or a measure. Or if you have a time signature of 32/4, then you will have 32 quarter notes or crotchets in a bar. If you have a time signature of 6/8, then you will have 6 eighth notes in a bar or 6 quavers in a bar. And if you have a time signature of 2/2, then you have 2 half notes in a bar or 2 minims in a bar. So this is literally what the numbers within a time signature mean. But they don't just tell us how many beats there are in a bar, they also tell us how to feel the pulse of that piece of music. And they do this by telling us the meter of the piece of music. And the meter within music just means where are the strong and weak beats, which beats within the bar are important and which beats within the bar are less important. And a good way of demonstrating this is by showing you the difference between 3/4 and 6/8. 3/4 literally means there are 3 quarter notes or crotchets within a bar, whereas 6/8 means there are 6 quavers or 6 eighth notes in a bar. Now, because 3 crotchets mathematically is exactly the same as 6 eighth notes, you would think that these time signatures have the same amount of beats in the bar, and therefore they are the same, when in fact they're not the same, and that is because of the meter and how we group up the notes within that bar. And there are 2 ways in which we group up notes within a bar. Firstly, we think about how many notes we're actually grouping up, and then secondly, we think about how many groups there are. So let's deal with how we actually group the notes up. Now, typically, there are 2 ways in which we group notes up, and that is simple and compound time. Simple time is where you will see eighth notes grouped into groups of 2 or 4 within a bar. Now, normally in a piece of music, when you see eighth notes next to each other, the tails for those eighth notes will be joined together. And this shows us how the notes are grouped up in the bar. So if you see eighth notes that are grouped into groups of 2 or 4, then that means that it is simple time. Whereas if you see eighth notes grouped into 3s, then that means it is compound time. Each of these groupings feels very different. If you have groups of 2 eighth notes or quavers in a bar, then it might sound something like this. Whereas if you have groups of 3 eighth notes instead, then you might feel the groups more like this. In the first example, you're feeling groups of 2, whereas in the second example, you're feeling groups of 3 instead. So that is the difference between simple and compound time, and how you might be able to see those groupings in a piece of music. But then there is a matter of how many groups there are, and there are 3 main groupings that you will see. There is duple, triple, and quadruple, which means there are 2 groups, 3 groups, or 4 groups. So if you have a time signature that is simple duple, then this means that you have 8th notes in groups of 2, because it's simple, and you have 2 of those groups, which means you have 2 groups of 2. If you have simple triple, then because it's simple, you have groups of 2, and because it's triple, you have 3 groups. So you have 3 groups of 2 8th notes. If it is simple quadruple, then you have groups of 2 because it's simple time, and you have 4 groups of those. So you have 4 groups of 2 8th notes. If you have compound duple, then you have groups of 3 because it's compound, and you have 2 groups. So you have 2 groups of 3 8th notes or quavers. If you have compound triple, then you have groups of 3 again, and you have 3 groups. So you have 3 groups of 3 8th notes. And finally, if you have compound quadruple, then you have groups of 3, again, because it's compound, and you have 4 groups. So you have 4 groups of 3 8th notes or quavers. Now, it's important to know that you're not always going to see pieces of music that just have a series of 8th notes. Instead of a group of 2 8th notes, you might have 1 quarter note, for example. Or if it's compound, instead of a group of 3 8th notes, you might have a quarter note and an 8th note. This depends on what rhythm and notes the composer wants to use. However, you will feel those groupings when you play the piece of music. So this takes me back to the difference between 3/4 and 6/8. 3/4 meaning there are 3 quarter notes in a bar, and 6/8 meaning there are 6 8th notes within a bar. Mathematically, this has the same number of notes within the bar. However, we feel those beats differently. 3/4 is a triple simple time signature. We have 3 groups of 2 8th notes. So we feel that as 1 and 2 and 3 and. We feel 3 groups of 2 8th notes. Whereas 6/8 is compound duple. So instead of feeling 3 groups of 2, we feel 2 groups of 3. So that would feel more like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So here are some examples of time signatures and how you might feel those time signatures. So firstly, this piece of music is written in 2/4, which means there are 2 quarter notes per bar. And in this piece of music, we can see the 8th notes are grouped into 2s, and each bar can fit 2 of these groups, which means that this is a simple duple time signature. So the time signature of 2/4 is a simple duple time signature. This piece has a time signature of 3/4, which means there are 3 quarter notes within a bar. And this piece also has 8th notes or quavers grouped into 2s, which means it's also a simple time signature. But in these bars, we can fit 3 of those groups. So therefore, this is a simple triple time signature, and 3/4 is a simple triple time signature. This piece is in 4/4, and 4/4 means there are 4 quarter notes per bar. And this piece also has 8th notes grouped into 2s or 4s. Sometimes you might see 8th notes grouped into 4s as well in a simple time signature. And because this bar can fit 4 groups of 2 8th notes, then that makes it a simple quadruple time signature. And 4/4 is a simple quadruple time signature. This piece is in 6/8, and in this piece, 8th notes are grouped into 3s, which makes it a compound time signature. And because we can fit 2 of these groups within a bar, that makes it a compound duple time signature. And 6/8 is a compound duple time signature. This piece is in 9/8, which means there are 9 8th notes in a bar. And this piece also has 8th notes grouped into 3s, which makes it a compound time signature. And each bar will fit 3 of these groups. So that makes it a compound triple time signature. And 9/8 is a compound triple time signature. And finally, this piece is in 12/8, and that means there are 12 8th notes per bar. And once again, 8th notes are grouped into 3s, which makes it a compound time signature. And in 12/8, we can fit 4 of those groups in a bar. So therefore, this is a compound quadruple time signature. And 12/8 is indeed a compound quadruple time signature. So in pieces that have a time signature of 6/8, 9/8, or 12/8, you will feel groups of 3 in each of those bars. Whereas pieces that use 2/4, 3/4, or 4/4, you will feel groups of 2 within those bars. Now, if you see a C in a piece of music instead of a time signature, then this means common time, and this is exactly the same as writing 4/4 in the piece of music. So if you see C where the time signature is, then this means there are 4 quarter notes per bar. And similar to this, you may see a C with a line directly down the middle of it. And this stands for cut time, and this is the same as writing a time signature of 2/2, which means there are 2 half notes in the bar. Now, 4/4 and 2/2 both will look the same, because 4/4 is 4 quarter notes, and 2/2 is 2 half notes, which once again, mathematically, is the same thing. 4 quarter notes and 2 half notes equals the same amount of notes in the bar. However, in a piece that's in 4/4, you will feel 4 stresses within that bar. You'll feel 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and... Whereas in a piece of music that's in 2/2, you will feel 2 stresses in that bar. So you'll feel 1, 2... Because instead of counting quarter notes, we're now counting half notes. Or, for Brits, instead of counting crotchets, we're now counting minims. And therefore, which beats are strong in that bar is slightly different. Now, one final thing to know is that you might come across some irregular time signatures that don't necessarily have all groups of 3 or all groups of 2. For example, something like a time signature of 5/8, which means 5 eighth notes in a bar. In a time signature of 5/8, you're not going to see all groups of 2, because that doesn't mathematically work. You'll be left with 1 note on its own. But you're also not going to see all groups of 3, because that also doesn't mathematically work. You would have 1 full group of 3 and then 2 spare notes. So in a time signature of 5/8, you will see 1 group of 3 and 1 group of 2, and this makes it irregular, because we've got a mixture of groups. This also happens in 7/8, for example, where we have 7 eighth notes in a bar, because once again, we'll have a mixture of groups of 3s and 2s. And this is why these time signatures are used much less often, although it is useful to know that you will see pieces where there are a mixture of those groupings, but those are much less common time signatures. Time signatures are quite important in a piece of music, because they do tell us how to play and feel that piece of music, and where to put the strong and weak beats, and how many beats there are in a bar. But lots of pieces of music use the same time signatures, so the most common time signature is 4/4. So once you are aware of how one piece feels in that time signature, then all other pieces will feel the same. For example, if you see a piece of music that uses a time signature of 6/8, and then you see another piece of music that uses a time signature of 6/8, you know that both of these are going to feel like 2 groups of 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. For example, each piece of music you see in 6/8 will have that same kind of grouping and that same lilt to it. And the same goes for all of the other regular time signatures, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, 6/8, 9/8, and 12/8. Another big topic that is important if you are trying to learn how to play the piano is chords. So if you want to learn more about chords, then head on through and I will see you there.